Well, as of the making of this video, it's been just a few days since Mr. Ravi Zacharias passed away. Now, I've been a critic of Mr. Zacharias in the past for a few different reasons, and they are really summarized in the book Cover Up in the Kingdom by Steve Bauman, and I've certainly been a vocal critic along those lines. I'm not going to revisit that material or that conversation here. I do want to say one thing before I get into the subject of this video, and that is that many people I know find it unseemly to be criticizing Mr. Zacharias just after his passing. Well, I will say this, that one of the issues here is, of course, you want to be sensitive to people when they're grieving, and if someone I know is grieving, I wouldn't go up and they really value Mr. Zacharias, I might not have this conversation with them. I'm making a video that people who want to watch can watch, and those who don't want to watch can ignore. So I'm not imposing my views on anybody. Now, why talk about Mr. Zacharias at this time? Well, one reason is because his legacy is being established right now. People are talking about him and the impact that he had on their lives, and I think it's fair game for me at that very same time to express some of my concerns with him. So again, Cover Up in the Kingdom includes a lot of material as to why I would have concerns about his legacy. In this video, however, I want to talk about a reality that I often find what Mr. Zacharias had to say just not being particularly helpful. Now, the reason I'm talking about this video in particular, it's a video where he addresses the issue of homosexuality, and it has over 4 million views, which is huge, right? Well, it's huge unless you're like a K-pop star or something, but for a Christian evangelist or a Christian apologist, yeah, that's huge. So why I want to talk about it is because YouTube kept suggesting that I watch this video in my recommended suggestions in the last few days. I assume that's because Mr. Zacharias was trending through social media given his passing. So I watched this video, and it really encapsulated a lot of the concerns I have about the quality of his teaching. So what I'm going to do here, I'll play a little bit of the introduction, and then I'm going to focus on, well, as you'll see, he divides his treatment of this topic into 3 parts, and I'll say more about that as we go. Let's just get started.
From the Stowe campus, it'll say, it says, how do you respond to non-believers who accuse Christians of being hateful to people who support lifestyles that are not according to the precepts of our faith?
I think this is a very important question, and they all are, really. I'd be a dishonest person if I said to you that that question doesn't worry me, that I don't even think about it. In fact, we as a team, our entire team, people like Nabil Qureshi, Michael Ramsden, Oz Guinness, Amy Ewing, our entire speakers team, have often sat around a table and said, how do we deal with this very trying social issue of our time? And even though the word is not used here, the idea is, the homosexual lifestyle and all that has come about in our time, how do we as Christians deal with it? So Joe, if you don't mind, I'd like to take an extended answer on this. Let me give you about 3 panels of an answer. The first panel is the logical problem. The second panel is what I call the theological problem. And the third panel is what I would call the relational problem, how you communicate it.
All right, so I want to say a couple things here at the outset. First thing about the way that Mr. Zacharias interprets the question. He kind of interprets it pertaining to, quote-unquote, the homosexual lifestyle. Well, yeah. I assume that it's a fair interpretation that the question of the ethics of same-sex relationships is central there. But if I were answering this kind of question, I would want to embed that within a larger conversation. You are more like, you often encounter the term LGBT, right? In fact, you might include or encounter a longer term, LGBTQIA or something like that. So what does that refer to? Well, of course, it's lesbian, gay, homosexual, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. And then it goes on from there. So often I is intersexual, A is asexual, and then you may have queer questioning plus some other issues as well. what's going on there? So a lot of Christians, to them, this is just sort of perplexing. They just don't understand really what this is. So let me explain it. All of those people are sort of quote-unquote lumped together because they are all challenging what is often called heteronormativity. And heteronormativity can be described as follows: that it is a normative expectation that sexual expression should be limited to monogamous heterosexual relationships and between a man and a woman, right? So that's heteronormativity. So anybody who doesn't conform to that is outside of heteronormativity. So that would be lesbians, gay people, bisexual people, transgender people. And in the case of transgender, what that is an individual whose self-understanding of their own sexuality does not align with their biological and genetic expression of that sexuality. So, in other words, their gender expression, how they want to live out in society, differs from their sexual reality of how they were born. So that's transgender. They find themselves excluded. And then intersex. Intersex is a physiological condition which refers to individuals who are neither male nor female by birth. So in terms of genetics and or physiology or anatomy, they are gender ambiguous. They are somewhere on a spectrum between male and female, because it turns out that male and female are just not the only categories in which human beings come. And that's not a postmodern deconstruction. That's biological reality. And so intersex people also often find themselves excluded by heteronormativity. Asexual people are people who have no sexual attraction to anyone. And so they also find themselves tacitly excluded by the heteronormative expectation that the normal expression of healthy human existence is to pair up into attraction to a person of the other sex and then entering into a monogamous matrimonial relationship with that individual. So this is an example of all sorts of people who perceive heteronormativity to be hegemonic. In other words, to be exclusive of them and to be marginalizing them and their voices. And they want to be heard. So the first thing I would say if I were Mr. Zacharias, or if I were given this question, is you have to understand where the question is coming from, the sense of people that feel excluded. And what can you say about that? The second thing I would say if I were Mr. Zacharias, or in his place, is I would say that the questioner assumes that there is just one Christian view on this issue. And in fact, given that this is the question doesn't simply specify homosexuality, but it really seems to be born out of a broader challenge to heteronormativity generally, then we should note that there are a diversity of Christian perspectives. Or you could say it this way: there are a diversity of perspectives by people who are thinking Christians, who are biblically informed, theologically reflective, engaging with their cultural context. Devout people disagree on this question. There are people that are affirming of same-sex relationships. There are people that affirm a particular therapeutic response to the gender dysphoria that seems to give rise to transgender identity issues. There are Christians, and I've met psychiatrists, for example, who advocate corrective, quote-unquote, surgery for people who are experiencing extreme transgender stress. And so they would actually advocate to relieve that stress from a therapeutic psychiatric perspective as a Christian psychiatrist. They would advocate, and they've thought through this, a particular surgery, corrective, quote-unquote, surgery for those individuals to align their anatomy and physiology with their self-understanding. Of course, other Christians disagree strenuously with that view, but you can't just play the no true Scotsman fallacy and say, yeah, but no true Christian would actually disagree with me. No, in fact, Christians do disagree. So those would be the two things that I would say at the outset to frame this question. First thing, again, is that this is what the question is born out of. It's a sense of exclusion from a heteronormative standard. And second, and it's a broad coalition of interests, not just gay people, but many different people find themselves excluded. And the second thing I would say is, again, that Christians do disagree on this issue. Now, Mr. Zacharias launches into the first of three main points that he wants to make on this topic. And the first point, he called it the logical issue there, but actually he goes on and explains he meant sociological. And what he then says is there are three modes of organizing society. He says there is a theonomous model in which order and law come from God. There is a heteronymous model in which law comes from a diversity of sources. And then there is an autonomous model of governing society and culture. And on the autonomous model, each individual decides for themselves. Now, the first thing I'm just going to say there, because he talks about this tripartite model of socio-political organization. He talks about it for about 5 minutes. And the first thing I want to say is it's not a helpful model. I don't think it's a helpful model. It's not the kind of thing you're going to find in any political science classroom. And it's way too abstract. And I just don't think it's illuminating. But more specifically than that, it actually doesn't at all illuminate the specific question this individual asked, which is in essence, as I said, why are certain people excluded from heteronormativity? Why do we have to chafe under the hegemony of heteronormative expectations that restrict matrimonial relationships to people who conform to the heterosexual standard? And for Mr. Zacharias to talk at length, at 5 minutes plus, about these three different models of society just doesn't illumine that question any more than he would have illumined the question 50 years earlier or 60 years earlier had somebody at a convention or church asked, why can't a black man marry a white woman? Now imagine that question being posed in the 1950s. Why can't a black man marry a white woman? And then the response is to talk for 5 minutes about three different models of governing society: theonomous, heteronymous, autonomous. That would provide no illumination at all. And the irony here is that when he finishes his first panel, everybody applauds. And I guarantee if you went into this congregation or to this audience and you asked them, what are you applauding? How did he actually address this specific question? How did this tripartite typology of the way societies are allegedly governed or organized, how did that illumine the question of why are certain people excluded from heteronormative matrimonial relationships? And I guarantee people wouldn't be able to give a response because there is no response. It is, as a friend of mine said, a word salad. It doesn't actually illumine the question. Okay, now I want to turn to the second part, the second panel, as he calls it, the theological panel. I'm going to play part of it and then offer a response. And then I'll conclude the video. I'm not going to bother with the third panel because I actually think the third panel is the strongest of them. It's simply in the third panel, he makes the modest observation that we ought to treat people with compassion when we disagree with them. I agree. That's important, always good to keep in mind. I don't have any real quibble with that. The first panel I think is completely irrelevant, and I'm going to look now at the second panel, and I'm going to argue that in his second panel, he just completely begs the question. So let's take a look at the second panel. I'm going to set this up like this. So in this panel, what is happening is he's introducing an experience he allegedly had with a reporter who asked him a question privately about why you Christians exclude gay people, and then this was his answer.
You know, I have a problem with Christianity, and here's my problem. Christians are generally against racism, but when it comes to the homosexual, they discriminate against the homosexual. How do you explain that? I said, I find your comments so interesting. In the first part of the question, it's an ism you're talking about. In the second part of the question, you particularize it with an individual. So I'm just fascinated by that, but that's okay.
You know what? Come on, man. He's trying to suggest that there's... And he doesn't actually come out and say anything that she said here that was quote-unquote interesting. He said, well, you said an ism, and then you particularized it to an individual. It's not hard to understand what this reporter is asking. She's asking, why do you reject prejudice against racial groups or racial minorities, but you justify prejudice against sexual minorities or against people who are outside of the heteronormative standards? That's a perfectly good, legitimate question to ask. And the fact that Mr. Zacharias says, well, it's interesting. You go from an ism to particularized to an individual. No, I mean, I don't even know what he's talking about there. She's just asking about apparently inconsistent standards toward prejudicial exclusion. Anyway, let's continue.
I said, here's what I want to say to you. The reason we believe that discrimination ethnically is wrong is because the race and ethnicity of a person is sacred. You do not violate a person's ethnicity and race. It is a sacred gift. And the reason we believe in an absoluteness to sexuality is because we believe sexuality is sacred as well. And that's why we make our choice that same way. I said, you will help me if you will tell me why you treat race as sacred and desacralize sexuality. She was very quiet. She said, I've never thought of it in those terms. Here's what I want to say to you. Marriage, as God has given it to us, and if you take the whole corpus of the worldview, is the most sacred relationship into which you will enter. Because love is given one word in English, but there are 4 words in the Greek.
Okay, I'm going to stop there. Let's just summarize what his response is. So this is really the heart of his theological response, which really is the response he's giving to the original question at this point almost 8 minutes earlier, which is, why do you Christians exclude people outside the heteronormative standards? I mean, that's the way I've interpreted it, but I think that's a fair interpretation of what the person was asking. So what's his answer? Before I give his answer, let's note then that he restated the question by way of this reporter in this anecdote he's recounting. And in the anecdote he's recounting, the reporter asks, why are you Christians, you reject racism, but you don't reject the exclusion of sexual minorities, right? You maintain your hegemony of heterosexual monogamous relationships. What's your answer? Why isn't that prejudicial? Here's his answer. Well, race is sacred, and that's why racism is wrong. And heterosexual normativity is sacred. Heteronormative, matrimonial marriage is sacred. And that's why, in fact, if you follow the logic through, that's why the gay or the person who's outside of heteronormative standards, who questions the legitimacy of heteronormative standards, is, in this case, analogous to the racist. Right? The person who is gay and saying, why can't I get married, is the person who is analogous to the racist, because they're the ones challenging that which is sacred, whether it be race or whether it be heteronormative standards. Okay, now you can question, if you like or not, the legitimacy of that comparison, but the main point I want to highlight here is that all he is doing in his entire response is restating the initial claim of the traditional Christian here, that heteronormative standards are sacred and inviolable. So when the sexual minorities, the gays, the lesbians, the bisexuals, the transgender people, the intersex people, the asexual people, they all ask, why are we excluded from your standard? He says, because our standard is the sacred right one. How is that an apologetic? Simply restating with and underlining and putting exclamation points on what you originally said is not providing an explanation to the people who believe that they are excluded from your heteronormative standard, or those people who believe you are being prejudicial in a way relevantly analogous to racism. Sexual discrimination is a thing, and certainly it is perceived to be a thing by the questioner, and his answer here provides no illumination at all. He simply, again, begs the question that is at issue by simply restating his position. And then he goes on, as we saw, and I stopped him here, but he begins to talk about the 4 loves in Greek, which has as much relevance to the question, to the direct question that was asked, as his discussion of these 3 models of society. It's all filler, right? It's not meat. It's not relevant content to the questioner. So, in fact, he offers here no explanation at all. And I would commend you. You can look up that video and you can watch it for yourself and see if in your estimation, if I've been unfair. And if you think I've been unfair, let me know why. Let me know what you think his substantive response to the question is. But as I watched that video, I saw no substantive response. So, in short, setting aside all the other concerns I've had with Mr. Zacharias and his ministry, one concern I had, exemplified by this video, is that quite often I would find that he was not actually giving helpful, let alone or even coherent advice or analysis. So, yes, that's I don't know how to end this video, so I guess I'll just end it there.